Welcome to the Educator Speaker Series, where educators collaborate, share ideas, and learn together. I am your host, Mr. Howard Fields. I would first like to thank you for joining us this Sunday evening to talk about formative assessments. Wow, what a loaded topic. That's the reason why we made sure we had a very special guest to join us, Ms. Sharice Atkins. Ms. Atkins, how are you?
I'm great, very excited to be here tonight. Thank you.
And we are very excited to have you. I do want to remind our audience members that this is a live interactive chat, and we will want you to respond to the question of the night. The question of the night is as follows. How do you formatively assess your students? If you are on Twitter, please use the hashtag ESSeries, and we will be monitoring Twitter to look at your responses. But without further ado, we do have instructional coach, Ms. Sharice Atkins, who is going to help us with this loaded topic, formative assessment. So, Ms. Atkins, can you please help us with formative assessment?
I sure can. So as Mr. Fields just stated, tonight we are going to be talking about a hot topic in education, and that is assessment. So as an instructional coach in a building of K-5 teachers, I get a lot of questions about assessments, and when I was a classroom teacher, it was something that was always on my mind. So let's jump right in and get started. First, we need to ask ourselves, what is the problem with our current practice of assessment? So in a typical classroom, students are faced with a lot of assessments. We definitely need the data, but how much is too much? Are we testing more than we're teaching? I know some teachers who would definitely say yes to that question.
And Ms. Atkins, I also know some administrators that would say yes to that question. So I must put you on the spot. My apologies for interrupting. What would you consider too much testing?
Well, that's a great question, but I'm not sure that it's one I can actually quantify an answer to. The number of assessments a student takes or a number that is actually necessary might be dependent upon their grade level, their age, the content area, so on and so forth. So it's not an answer I unfortunately can give right off the bat, but we are going to talk about the number of assessments students take and how we might be able to combat that problem.
Sounds good.
All right, so I found this quote that really struck a chord with me. So I'd like to give everybody a second just to read through the quote. All right, hopefully you had a chance to read through that. Once upon a time, the testament of a good teacher was how well students could answer questions that most likely came on a test. But the times of education are changing. We're not just teaching students to be good test takers, we're teaching students to be thinkers and problem solvers, I apologize. So where do traditional assessments fit into that mold of thinking? I would argue that traditional assessments are not a good gauge of how successful we're being at producing thinkers and problem solvers. Just to put things into perspective, I want you to think about how many assessments your students take each year. This could vary depending on the grade level of your students or the content area you teach or the level of the building you work in. If you're a principal or another type of administrator, I want you to think about the vast amounts of data that you see from all of these assessments. And what about the data that never even reaches your desk? So with all of that being said, is it clear? I hope it's becoming clear to you why we need a shift in our practices.
A shift in our practices is something that we certainly need, but when we talk about formative assessments, a lot of times in educations, I know teachers will say, well, Mr. Fields, we know that there's evidence to support that we can do better. That's a given. But how do we go into the how? We want to know what and how can we get there. Ms. Atkins, please tell me that your presentation will at least attempt to address that question.
Definitely going to attempt. So that's a great question. We need a lot of information, but how do we get that information without giving all of those tests? It's a great question, and the solution for you is Formative or informal assessments that happen in the moment of learning and don't interrupt that instructional and learning process within the classroom. So tonight, we're going to be talking about ways for you to administer, quote unquote, administer formative assessments, and also how to collect that data. So first, you must ask yourself what it is that your students need to know and be able to do in order to master the standard at hand. We have to get away from the practice of just assigning a percentage correct on a test to determine student success. So how we do this is to create a rubric or achievement level descriptors. So in the building where I work, part of our planning process is for teachers to create achievement level descriptors for each standard throughout that unit. And in our building, we follow a can-but format of a rubric or achievement level descriptors, which you can see here. Keep in mind, every student can do something. So once you have determined how you're going to gauge student progress, you just need a couple of things to get started. A clipboard and a tracking sheet like this make it easy to get a quick achievement level for each student on any given task. You can quickly look across the row of all the activities a student has done related to a particular standard and see how they are faring at any given point in the unit. And that way, you're not waiting until the very end of the unit to determine who needs enrichment and who needs intervention.
So essentially, Ms. Atkins, you're referring to using backwards assessment mapping. I saw that you had the standard at the top. From there, we would just make sure we are using that in your example to look at student data and then assess them without some type of formative assessment. Is that fair to say?
That is absolutely fair to say. So as we go through the remainder of the presentation, you'll see that there are ways to gather information about a student's level of understanding or level of mastery based on those achievement level descriptors that we set before we ever even started teaching.
Thank you.
All right, so in addition to a tracking sheet like this, and by the way, there are electronic versions of this if you are a tech-savvy person who uses an iPad or a tablet in the classroom. This is obviously a paper version, which is also readily available online. In addition to those things, some Post-it notes are handy so that you can jot notes to yourself about common things that you're seeing or hearing throughout the classroom. All of those pieces then become teaching points later in the lesson or the next day.
Okay.
All right, so now that you know how to collect information, let's talk about ways you're going to get that information. One of the quickest ways to gather understanding from a student's perspective is to make rounds during independent work time and to hold one-on-one student conferences. A place to keep notes about those conversations is very helpful. So you need to find a system that works well for you. On your screen, you see a couple of examples, but those are definitely not all of your options. Next, let's talk about student dialogue. When you give students an opportunity to turn and talk or have a table discussion, students will be really honest with one another about what they know. So if you are diligent in listening in on those conversations, you will quickly learn where students are in the learning process. Additionally,
so Ms. Atkins,
I'm sorry.
For example, with our audience members who are on Twitter, and our question of the night is, how do you formatively assess your students? We can actually, you and I, that is, we can use that as a formative assessment to really gauge where our audience members are with their level of expertise. Would that be safe to say?
That would be safe to say. That would be an excellent formative assessment for us in this situation.
I would also like to remind our audience members before Ms. Atkins continues that if you don't necessarily want to respond to the question of the night, but you would like to ask another question, please go on to Twitter using the hashtag ESSeries, ask the question. We will continue to monitor Twitter and we will hopefully get your comment or your question in.
Thank you for the reminder. So another way to use a formative assessment is for students to do presentations or be the teacher. So you've probably heard the saying that true mastery has been achieved when a student can teach someone else that concept. So when you allow students that opportunity to be the teacher, you can quickly determine their level of mastery. Next, student response journals. It's important for students to be able to share or discuss their learning verbally, but it is also very important for them to be able to write about their learning. So give students an opportunity to put their thoughts on paper in a non-threatening environment. It doesn't always have to be for a grade, but you as the teacher will learn a lot from what students convey through writing. Something I'm sure many of our audience members tonight have heard of and probably even used in their classrooms are exit tickets. The key to exit tickets is it is not necessary to ask 20 questions to determine whether or not your students, quote, get a concept. You can simply ask one or two thoughtfully planned questions, and from those you'll be able to judge where students are making mistakes, what their misconceptions are, and what their understandings are. All of those things become teaching points the next day. The sample on your screen is a great exit ticket in my opinion because it not only asks students to demonstrate their knowledge, but it also asks them to rate their own understanding, which is a very informative piece for teachers as well. And finally, for tonight, the last type of assessment that I'm going to share with you is a really powerful way for you to gather information about your students' understanding, and that's to allow them to demonstrate their knowledge in an application type setting. So let them design a solution to a problem, let them conduct an experiment, let them solve a math problem in the best way that they see fit. There are many opportunities that provide you with the information you need, but also allow students a more real-world application of knowledge. As an adult, we don't get judged on a paper pencil test to determine our level of knowledge. We demonstrate our knowledge based on how well we perform in everyday situations. If I leave the grocery store and it's pouring down rain and I don't have an umbrella, what do? I need to buy materials at the best cost for a project. What do? I have to prepare for a job interview. What do? These are not scenarios that require a paper pencil assessment. So this evening I have shared with you a few ways that you can gather formative data from your students to gauge where they are in the learning process. What I have shared with you tonight is obviously not an all-inclusive list. There are many, many methods of assessing your students throughout the learning process. And those ways may vary dependent upon the grade level you teach or the content area that you teach. But I would like to wrap up the formal part of this presentation with another quote. Carol Ann Tomlinson states that informative assessment isn't an end in itself, but the beginning of better instruction. So this also struck a chord with me because our students deserve the best instruction that we can provide them. And by continually interrupting that instruction and learning with formal assessments, we're taking away some of that quality instruction. So you've probably heard the phrase that students learn by doing. So in the classroom, we need to give them as many opportunities to do as possible, and we need to assess throughout that learning process.
Again, thank you so much, Ms. Atkins. To our audience members, we appreciate you joining us for our first show. I do want to remind you, just in case we had some technical difficulties and a few times where Ms. Atkins' presentation was blocked off, we will have a archive version of this particular presentation in the description bar. So with that being the case, Ms. Atkins, as an instructional coach, as you continue to have conversations with teachers, what do you consider the biggest obstacle that stands in the way between using a formative as opposed to a summative assessment?
I think we're caught up in a scenario of needing formal data for different purposes. And it might depend upon the type of school that you're working in, but in some schools, that data and being able to prove what your students know with numbers is really important. And so I think sometimes teachers get hung up on having to submit numbers and scores and all of those things, and that takes away from the actual learning and the modification of our instruction based on where students are in that process.
Thank you so much. We do have a question as it relates to using formative assessments in the classroom. A teacher will state that they are using formative assessments in the classroom. It is going particularly well in that classroom. However, during parent-teacher conferences or just brief conversations with parents, they are more or less trained, not all the time, but sometimes trained to have something tangible in the form of an A, B, C, D grade, which is more summative in nature. What advice would you give this particular person?
Well, that's a great question, and it is a shift for parents as well to get away from that letter grade system that we are accustomed to. How I would suggest a teacher address that situation is for students and parents to be let in on those achievement level descriptors. I didn't mention that earlier, but that's definitely something that should be shared with students so they know where they are on the continuum of mastering that standard. If you share that information with parents as well, then you can have a dialogue with families that is more along the lines of, currently your student is at a 2, which means they can do this, but in order to get to a 3, we still need to work on this. And I actually think that's much more informative for families than your student has a C.
Thank you so much, Ms. Atkins. Before we end, is there anything you would like to add to your presentation or to just sum up tonight?
I would just encourage teachers, especially if this is not a practice that you are currently implementing into your classroom, to take a chance and go out on a limb and do some of these formative assessments instead of just always the paper pencil, you got a 60%, do better next time scenario. Additionally, I have some resources why formative assessments are important, articles on that, as well as some sample formative assessments that will be included with this presentation in the description section when you see this video posted.
Again, thank you so much to our audience members. I do want to reiterate the point that we will archive the presentations. We appreciate you joining us for our first Educator Speaker Series. We will attempt to make sure we are involved in this live interactive chat at least 2 times a month. If you have any topics you would like for us to discuss, you can please send that to me at HEFields3 on Twitter. Again, HEFields3 on Twitter. And we will continue to make sure that all of our educators are here collaborating, sharing ideas, and learning together. Again, thank you so much for everyone that will make this come into fruition. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.